I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. During the legislative session, Democratic state lawmakers pushed through a bill, now awaiting the governor's signature, that would require health insurers make brand name drugs available at the same cost as a generic drug if the covered generic drug is unavailable. The measure is supposed to ensure New Yorkers don't face disruption in their prescription drug needs. For more on the proposal, we're joined by the measure's assembly sponsor, Brooklyn Democrat Phara Souffrant Forrest. Welcome back to the show, Assemblymember.
Thank you so much, David, for having me tonight.
So the provisions of this bill are triggered by a quote-unquote supply issue that is recognized by the FDA. Are shortages a widespread recurring issue with generic drug supplies that warrants this type of legislative response?
Yeah, it's actually currently happening right now. For example, ADHD medication shortages are actually the most cited recent example, which drives this bill. And measures have already been passed in other spaces like Illinois, where they passed a nearly identical law. So, requiring insurance policies to cover brand name drugs when generic or therapeutic equivalents are available.
And what has been the ramifications, as far as you're aware, to those New Yorkers, for example, who have gone to their pharmacist looking for a prescription drug refill or maybe looking to start a new prescription, and they're told, sorry, the generic's not available, but we do have this brand name drug?
Either they go without or they have to pay out of pocket.
And is there a reason to believe there's a large difference between the generic drug price and the brand name drug price to the consumers?
I mean, to the consumer, yes, there is a price difference. The price difference between generic version of a drug and the brand name could be the equivalent of several $100s. So it does make a difference.
So in the case of a difference of several $100s between the name brand and generic drugs, you said during the floor debate that ultimately the insurer will be responsible for absorbing that cost. Is there any sort of mechanism or safeguard in this bill to ensure then that that cost isn't subsequently passed back to the consumers in the form of higher premiums?
So this question came up again during debate, and the scope of the bill is to ensure that our constituents, people who live in our communities receive the drugs that they need at the time that they need it. Shortages historically are not long lasting. The Federal Drug Administration works hard to prevent these shortages from happening. Also, insurance companies, that's why we have them, is to insure us in these times of needs. And so what may be several $100s to a person who is figuring out how they're going to get their ADHD medication or the diabetic medication, it's really drops in the bucket when it comes to the insurance company. And again, it's not a lot of drugs. It's short-lived. It is something that the FDA, along with the different PBMs and the drug manufacturers, they actively work to prevent this. So it's not as common, but when it does happen, it has really big impacts.
So it sounds like what you're saying is while hundreds of dollars might matter to a consumer, given the scope of a health insurance's operations, they can absorb that in their bottom line without passing it along to consumers.
Yeah.
That sounds like a very altruistic vision of insurers, though, because historically they are portrayed as people who will, penny pinch to the nth degree. So is there a reason to assume then that this will be that one case where health insurers say, you're right, we can absorb this, we can take on this additional cost, we can all be good stewards?
Well, David, I think at this point, what choice do they have
Well, they
at the
could
end of the day?
charge higher premiums to their customers.
Well, I think that came up in the debate.
Hmm.
And, again, I'm not one to block people from making their own pieces of legislation. But at this time, from what we had calculated on both the Assembly and the Senate side, that this is very
Mm.
negligible, very negligible to the insurance companies. And if they find that there is hardship, feel free, introduce a bill, we'll work it out with you. But at this time, I need to make sure that my constituents, my people get the drugs they need when they need them.
And would this apply to all insurance coverage in the state or just the private carriers?
Only private carriers.
So then what does that mean for someone who's on Medicaid, for example, who has a prescription for a generic drug and there's a shortage in that case? Are they going to have to pay for it, or does the state already have some sort of mechanism for covering the difference in cost between a generic
The
and name
state
brand?
has some sort of mechanism. Yes, the state has mechanisms to make sure that you get the drugs that you need. We don't have that problem over here.
There's no sort of higher copay for a Medicaid patient or someone on the essential plan if they have to get a name
No,
brand drug? Okay.
no.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Assemblymember Phara Souffrant Forrest, a Brooklyn Democrat who pushed through legislation this year that would require health insurers cover name brand drugs at the same price as generic drugs when there is a shortage of a generic drug. You mentioned the shortage issue not being a prolonged issue, but I was looking at the service GoodRx, and they said while there is no set standard for how often or how long a drug shortage might last, they said that on average drug shortages persist for about 18 months before they're resolved. You implied that they can be something not that long, though. What's your understanding of the situation based on?
From 2013 to through 2023, the FDA had listed approximately 30 to 50 drugs per year, right? Right. There was one year it was crazy. But then in 2024, there were only 15. Now there is an increase currently. I think we're at about 85 as per people who debated the bill. But those could be attributed to the fact that we have, in general, a shortage and also supply side issues when it comes down to tariffs things coming into the US. So again, those things, whether it is tariffs, whether it is supply side, whether whatever the issue is, when it comes down to patients, they ought to be getting the medication that they need, especially if it's a generic shortage. That means that there's really a shortage. So
We've been focusing on the relationship between the insurers and the consumers. What about those middlemen, the pharmacists? Have you heard from them at all on this issue in terms of how the situation does or doesn't impact their ability to continue to operate? Because we have heard issues from them, not in this context, but other complaints they've had about insurers and what they will reimburse them for certain drugs. So have you gotten any feedback from pharmacies?
So I haven't got pharmacies necessarily calling my office complaining about this, but I work on some other bills for prior authorization. This is not the first time we're dealing with making sure that the chain to the consumer of medications to the consumer is not halted. And what I have heard is that, insurers have this constant battle with the pharmacists. And so I do care about the small business. I do care about the impact of these small pharmacists in perhaps in a town, now having to battle that out with the insurance company over, the medication for ADHD. I feel for them. But again, the scope of this bill was to ensure that on the side of the insurance carriers that they do their part and make sure that they provide coverage for the brand name drug when generics are in shortage.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with Assemblymember Phara Souffrant Forrest. She's a Brooklyn Democrat. Assemblymember, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, David.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.